Okay, so we are going to talk about some of the basic parts of a camera. So one of the parts the part that I would tell you is the most important part of the camera is your lens. Okay, this is what makes one of the tools that people think the least about when they're buying a camera. They always are worried about what the camera can do and the settings in the camera. But to me, the lens is what makes great photography. Okay, lens and then the person, the artist. Okay, but this tool lets me do more than my camera does. If I had a whole selection of lenses, I would rather have a whole selection of lenses in the most basic camera than the fanciest camera in one lens. But lenses zoom in and zoom out, or some lenses are called prime lenses, and those don't zoom, and those are usually designed to give you a shallow depth of field, or they have an aperture setting that benefits you, and they're usually very sharp. But most people buy zoom lenses. So your lens is one part of the camera, the body of your camera, and sometimes they're together, right? Some cameras, the lenses don't come off. But the body of your camera is what has the sensor in it. So the sensor in this camera is actually visible, so I'll pull that out and show you. But that is the sensor. The little green in the back is the sensor in this camera. And that is what captures the image. So that has millions of dots. So like when you buy your camera, if it's 24 megapixel, there's 24 million little dots in that sensor that are capturing data when you take a picture. So the sensor, this is your shutter release. This is the button that takes the picture, and it activates the camera when you push it. It says, hey, take a picture. You've got your control dial, which is going to let you change your aperture, your shutter speed, and then in your menu you'll usually have the ability to change your ISO and some of the other settings in the camera. And so those are the basic parts of a camera. It's going to be your shutter release button, your lens, your camera. The actual shutter is inside the camera, so it's not something I can show you, but it is a device that opens and closes inside of the camera. You've got your monitor on the back, and those are the core elements of a camera that I would expect somebody to know.
So let's talk a little bit about ISO. We've discussed aperture and f-stop. We've discussed shutter speed, so you know what that is. So the question is, what is ISO?
So ISO is a setting in the camera that actually changes how much light the camera needs. So when there was film, there was actually crystals that would be different sizes, and changing those sizes would make the camera need less or more light. So in digital cameras, they actually just increase the amount of power going to the sensors so that they're more sensitive or less sensitive to light. So the most basic example would be a 100 to do a 200 ISO setting. If you had your camera set at 100 ISO, it would need a certain amount of light. If you change it to 200 ISO, you're going to double the power that's going to the camera. It's doubling the sensitivity of those sensors. And so now your camera would need half as much light to take a picture that was the same amount of bright. So it would have the same exposure if you doubled your ISO. So quite often you're not usually trying to double your ISO, you're just trying to lighten or darken an image or make your shutter speed faster or change your aperture, and you would use ISO as a tool that changes the need for light.
Okay, and the one thing to remember as far as that's what it is, but the thing to remember is what does it do. So essentially this, if you have a bright sunshiny day, you probably only need like a 100 or 200 ISO, but if you're using like a 1600, essentially it's going to make your shot look very grainy. It's going to be way too much sensitivity for that amount of light. So that's why usually you're going to want to try to get the lowest ISO that you need and then adjust your other settings in order to make your picture correct. When you start shooting in the dark though, you'll have to put a higher ISO because it needs more power in order to be more sensitive, and it's all about getting that balance so that you don't risk a grainy shot, but you still have enough power to the sensor that you can get the shot you're looking for.
Right. Yeah, you always want to use the lowest ISO setting that actually works. So sometimes, like I had a picture of me in high school playing sports that was really, really grainy, but the lighting was really bad, and I loved the photo. So even though it was a grainy photo, if they had used
something better than nothing.
it's better. Yeah, it's better than nothing, and it was one of my favorite pictures because it caught me at a great moment. Right. So sometimes having a grainy picture is still worth it, but the lowest ISO that does what you want is the right ISO setting to use.
So let's talk about lens selection. Since that's probably one of the more important things, it's really good to understand what they are, what they do, and how they work.
Yeah. So some of these lenses, I pulled out a bunch of lenses that are a lot the same, and I just wanted to talk a little bit about the differences that you get in doing them, right? So let's talk about the most common thing that you get, right? So this lens right here is an 18-55, and it is what comes with almost every camera. So there's some that have a little bit more range, but they're a lens that covers kind of a normal range, and they have a normal aperture setting. Okay, they do make that same range covered in more professional lenses that have better aperture range, that are going to be physically way bigger, and financially they cost 5 to 10 times more than what the standard basic lens is going to cost.
However, you're gaining stability, you're gaining clarity, and there's a bunch of stuff that you get with these nicer lenses that justify the cost.
Yeah, so let's talk about these ones, for instance, because I think these are the ones that I have the most common, where somebody's like, hey, what are the differences between these? These two lenses right here, they actually cover almost identical ranges. So how close or how big something is the exact same in your picture. This one's physically way bigger. So why is it so much bigger? There's a couple of things. So the number one thing that makes it way bigger is this one has a much smaller number, an actual bigger opening for aperture. So this is a 2.8, where this lens is a 5.6. Both these are stabilized, but this lens is also a professional series lens. So all of the seals are water sealed. So if you were shooting and it started to rain on you, a little bit of rain isn't going to get into the electronics as fast on something like this as it would this. If you had a water-sealed camera, you could actually shoot in the rain with something like this.
And as a perfect example, I used this exact lens in the jungle. I got some great shots of the jungle, but before we left the jungle, I ended up having to do some maintenance on it because of the humidity. Basically, was
condensation got inside,
starting to kill it. On this lens, this is the one I now use on a very regular basis. The big thing that I've seen is the stability. It has stabilizers in it that are internal, which is part of why it's a larger encased lens. But the stability, the clarity, and just there's a bunch of things that you gain in robustness and control that you can't have here. And I'll show you some shots with this lens that I was using in the jungle, and some shots with this one that I did on some ducks recently.
Right, and they both are going to take decent pictures, but when it comes to the science, they're building these for professionals, so they're more accurately built. They're usually tougher, so there's more metal parts inside of them, and then the glass they use, they coat better to give you better clarity. And so those are common components in professional series lenses.
And one thing when he talks about the f-stop, you can take more focused and background fuzzed out or bokeh shots with this that you can't do with this. So There are some things that this will limit you in doing that this won't.
Right, but the zoom is very similar. So we have a couple other ones that I wanted to just kind of point out. This is the most common little fixed focal length lens that we sell. This is Canon's 50, and it is usually a little over $100 usually is what you're looking at for something like this. So it's as you move up, you get a more professional series going up to like a 51.4. You're going to spend $300 or $400 on usually a 51.4, and there's even another step up from that that's a 51.2. And so those are build quality increases a little bit, and then the aperture is you get more aperture range as you spend more money,
which gives you better portrait abilities.
Yeah,
you can do things
like
that you can't do with the other ones.
Ability, low light ability. So like the sports, for this one, if you're using sports, this gives you faster shutter speeds because it lets in more light. So if you had a kid playing basketball and it's indoors, I would totally tell you that this would be a huge benefit. But it's a lot more money.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's 3 times as much.
So going across, these two lenses are about the same focal. They are the exact same focal length. This one just lets in more light. These two lenses are about the same focal length. This one just lets in more light. Same thing here. Same focal length, more light, a little bit clearer. And then I put some extreme lenses on this end. So this is a super wide lens. So this is a lens that lets you take a really, really wide field of view. So it sees a lot of stuff. It makes, so if you were at a scenic vista and you were trying to get everything in the picture, this is a super wide, and that's what you would use in that situation. And this is a super telephoto. This one goes up to 600 millimeters. And this would be used usually for wildlife is the most common use. But if you need to take a picture of something that's really far away, this lens is designed for that.
Cool. So that's a basic on lenses. That's why some cost more, some cost less. The key is really knowing what you want to do with that lens. Are you doing photography from a distance? Are you doing portraits? Are you doing wildlife? What are you doing, and what light levels does it have, and how much can you afford? And then once you've nailed down those things, then you can start making decisions on the lens, which again is the most important part of taking the photography.
Right. And there's some financial considerations to it. Sometimes it's just a financial issue, but
Yes.
but there are definitely some differences in those.
Okay, guys, hopefully this is valuable to you. If you have questions, leave them in the discussion box below, and I'll get to them as best I can. And I got to say thanks to Rex Allen from Allen's Photography for letting us come into the store and check all this stuff out. If people are interested in these cameras here in Utah, where can they go to find them?
So we have 4 stores in Utah. We have in Orem, Provo, Layton, and Holiday. And then we have a website, allenscamera.net. We'd love for you to visit. If you have any questions, we're happy to help.
All right, guys. Thank you for watching.